Welcome to Talking Tuesday. I am your host, Fancy Quant, and today I am really excited to bring back Peter Carr to the podcast here. So, for those of you that don't know who Peter Carr is, just a quick introduction. He is the chair of the Finance and Risk Engineering Department at NYU Tandon School of Engineering. So, that's, I believe, the Financial Engineering Masters at NYU Tandon. NYU has two programs. Peter Carr's background academically and professionally is quite astounding if you actually go through all of his actual works. So I've went on his page. I've looked at many of his papers. I'm very impressed. But anyways, he was the head of quant research at Bloomberg. He was also the global head of market modeling at Morgan Stanley. And so today we're going to bring him in to talk a little bit about quant master's programs because he has a background of academics. So he has, the department chair here, and he runs this quant program at NYU. He also has worked in the industry, and so we're going to discuss the structure and design of quant programs and ranking systems in general, specifically because I came out with a ranking this past year, as well as kind of talking about the ins and outs of how to actually structure one of these quant programs, because it is far more challenging than one would ever imagine. But anyways, without further ado, let's just dive on in. Okay, so I brought you on today specifically because we had a past discussion, and you were also the director of NYU Tandon's program. But we're going to kind of dice apart, I guess, and discuss the details of structuring Quant Finance Masters in 2022. And then also talking about the struggles of the ranking programs here. So many people know I've created a ranking. It's caused a little bit of a stir with a few programs. But we'll talk about kind of the rankings and why it's such a challenge. So if you were to structure a program, what do you think the main focus of one of these quant masters should be here? Like what are programs working towards as the main, I guess, driver of one of these programs?
Yeah, so I'm thinking, of course, about master's programs, not undergraduate. And I do see the role of these master's programs as a terminal degree. And so to structure a program, I do actually dynamically program my way backwards from when students graduate to basically when they apply. And so the set of questions one naturally wants to answer is, when would a student graduate and what would you expect them to know when they graduate? And because I come from industry and I do see these master's degrees as essentially preparing students for a role after they graduate in the financial industry. First, when they graduate is actually something that you need to think about. And I would say in my experience, there's kind of hiring seasons and tends to be more in the first half of the year than the second. And so you sort of ideally have people ready to go to start work in the first half of any given year. And so then, one thinks about how long it should be. And, there's sort of natural constraints on the question in the sense that it's, I don't think you can get away with anything less than a year. And I don't think you can get away with anything more than 2 years. So it's kind of like in between, 1 year and 2 years. And ours is 2, but with the ability to graduate in a year and a half if you work really hard at it. But and I do tend to lean towards taking longer than taking shorter within that interval, just because you're going to be in competition with graduates from other programs. So the more you know when you graduate, the better off you are. And so even though I understand time value of money and opportunity costs and all that, but I figure, compared to, an undergrad degree, as we all know, is 4 years. So, a typical master's degree is actually closer to 2 than 1 year. And so ours is like that too. So that's why I tend to favor it. I just think there's a lot of material. And also, like, it's getting ever more diverse, let's say. So you're bringing in people from diverse backgrounds and then also teaching them an ever wider set of things. So it does take longer to do all that. So anyway, then we get to the nitty gritty question, what should the curriculum be? And, let's say there's, an easy way to answer that in a sense is look at the intersection of what everybody else is offering and offer that at a minimum, and then, tailor around the edges. And, so if we just simply did that, there's, these programs all kind of grew out of, let's say, derivatives pricing on the sell side, but they've actually moved quite a bit away from that initial start. But let's say the sort of fundamentals still need to be taught. And what would those be? Well, in my opinion, like the prerequisites, for example, for our program just coming in, and then we would tend to continue along these roads, is the prerequisites are probability, statistics, linear algebra, multivariate calculus, and programming. And we basically continue down every one of those roads. A prerequisite is not finance or economics, and we teach that in the master's program. And but we do so using those tools I just mentioned. So the main thing that probably that people won't have at the undergrad level but do need at the master's level is like stochastic calculus. And I think that, let's say, as I was saying to you before we started, it's uncertainty is endemic to finance. I mean, finance is essentially study of how to think about the passage of time under uncertainty. And so you let's say have to have basic understanding of how to think about uncertainty under your belt by the time you graduate, or else forget about it. So so actually, that's an important point, because many of the more fashionable things were actually developed, let's say, in other realms where uncertainty is less of an issue. So when we teach machine learning, for example, we're always stressing the application to finance, especially taking into account the fact that we're actually small data, and that there's a lot of noise. So anyway, but as it, still speaking about curriculum, again, the key thing is that people be prepared for their interviews. And what's asked during interviews? Well, sometimes it's brain teasers, which are, let's say, typically we don't teach it during the curriculum, but actually, you will also get domain expertise questions. And often those are meant as a screen, meaning they'll ask what they think is a simple question. If you can't answer it, well, the interview's over. And, so.
Okay, so before we cut out here, I think you made an excellent point, which was there's a time constraint within a master's program because you only have a year and a half, maybe 2 years as the maximum, right? You can't be pushing into 3-4 years. It just becomes not competitive. Mm-hmm. And then also you have this main focus, this main goal, which is how do we take students, how do we prepare them, and how do we place them into the industry? And I think you can break that down into 2 core parts here, which is going to be one, education, which you're talking about, the core fundamentals of quantitative finance, risk management, looking at those a long time. And then also you have the soft skills side, which is job placement, interviewing skills, communication skills. And I think we're coming back to that key crux of the whole problem of these programs in general, which is how do you fit all of this into a very short period of time? And then how do we layer in now data science, machine learning, cryptocurrencies? Everyone's trying to grapple with how do you add all this to the curriculum. And yet it's so challenging to get all that in there and prepared, especially when you see programs that are like a year, which I have no idea how they're going to do that. I mean, I graduated, I don't know, man, it's been like 8 years, 5 years. It's been a while. But after graduation, I remember feeling like I was so overwhelmed. And as one of the graduates told me, it's kind of like drinking from a fire hose. You go to quant programs and it's like they're just dumping, stochastic calculus and like risk management, metrics. And now you got data science coming in and statistics, and it's all coming at you when you graduate. And I felt like I was so underprepared. And yet I've been in the career now for like almost 8 years. There's an infinite amount to know even going forward. And so I think that's one of these hard problems to grapple with programs is how do you structure that curriculum in such a way that you cover everything? And I think one of the problems I see, so kind of touching on the rankings here, is some of the programs I feel like now are just so broad and so shallow that we're not getting value on the industry side. And I'm seeing too with machine learning, my biggest gripe and complaint here. I see people now saying, Dimitri, I can price a derivative product with machine learning in seconds. It's super quick and easy. You just throw them all in. And then I have to go, well, you can do that with non-parametric modeling too, but you don't get the full fundamental, interactions between everything. You're just getting a very shallow pricing metric. So it might work for the buy side, but it's definitely not going to work for the sell side.
Yeah. Well, I'd say regarding the time constraint, I mean, one point is, you give a man a fish and versus teach a man to fish is a very big difference, right? So I mean, I think there's some truth to that we can, let's say, try to more or less convey a mode of operation that people will be in for the rest of their working careers, which will include, self-educating. It has to. So, so basically, let's say, as I said before, I mean, we don't actually require finance economics as prerequisites. So there'll be a lot of language that people are basically going to have to learn. And like much of that master's degree is, in fact, especially at the beginning, learning the language, but to a deeper degree, maybe learning the mode of thinking. So sort of, let's say, being suspicious if someone's offering you a free lunch or something like that. Let's say, and it can be, let's say, there's a lot of subtlety. Let's say, just because, let's say, something worked in the past, is no guarantee to work in the future. And you really got to understand what that means. It could mean survivorship bias. So let's say, it's kind of like, in some ways, that's why I really do favor having a lot of practitioners doing the teaching, because let's say, even if they're not as attuned to what's going on in academia, they're very attuned to, let's say, the shortcomings of standard thinking. So at least they can convey the skepticism that's necessary. Okay. So that, because if you, let's say, when you're coming into a field not knowing anything, there are these highly respected professors talking to you. I mean, it is natural to think that everything they're saying is God's gospel. And only to find out, like, sometimes what you're taught is really just, canon in academia and not really widely used in industry. Like, specifically, utility functions in economics are never used in industry. Okay. But so, we put very little emphasis on them in our program, but, maybe you see them in other programs, and that's a shame. And, one way I can ensure that nobody is going to see utility function in my program is to make sure all classes are taught by practitioners. So, in designing a curriculum, or more broadly, a program, it's more a philosophy than, a concrete set of rules. And, the curriculum and program are itself going to have to evolve with the times. So just making sure you're not insulated is part of the battle. So, and that can happen, okay, by bringing in practitioners to teach, but even if that's not so easy, by doing like what you're doing now, reaching out to, as you do, to people. And, nowadays with Zoom, it's a lot easier than it used to be to stay connected. So anyway, but I would tend to agree that they should probably be a little bit longer than they could be in the past because of a wider variety of subjects that are current. And as you bring in the things you mentioned, it's hard to drop some of the more traditional subjects because actually the people doing the interviewing are probably more familiar with the traditional subjects than the new ones. And so are probably just going to ask what they know rather than what they don't know. And so, it does mean that students are going to have to, let's say, work hard, but, and also, I mean, what we do is, although we formally start in September, we have a boot camp the summer before, and I think a lot of programs are doing that now.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of a way of lengthening it if you think about it. And but we do it so that it starts off online, so that, because like most programs, most of our students are international and wouldn't be able to start soon after they're accepted because of visa implications. So anyway, but by having an online start initially, we do, and we're also, that also kind of homogenizes the incoming group because, again, they have diverse backgrounds. And so we make it voluntary, and people can just pick and choose what they feel they need to know to kind of start in September with everybody more or less on the same page.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the boot camp. So when I went to Michigan, they had a boot camp, and I'm somewhat culture shocked as I'm showing up, and there's languages being spoken everywhere, but English isn't one of them. And and yet I mean, some of the students are coming from, like, one student was a CPU designer.
Wow.
So electrical engineering, his specialist is in designing CPUs. And then you've got a couple other students that are electrical engineers, and then we had mechanical engineers, math majors, and then we had the two token finance students, myself and another American. And I think the boot camp itself was so beneficial. And kind of what you're saying, right? We're extending the program a little bit. It's also like I said, non-official start, because we were able to kind of grapple with the ideas, get down more of the traditional finance ideas and how we're going to be applying the mathematics to it before we really get taking off in class. And so I do think more programs should offer the boot camps. I mean, Michigan's was mandatory, but
the other point is, we do it pass fail as opposed to a letter grade.
Yep.
And like the thinking there is, you make a little bit of effort, you'll pass. And so we're trying to take away the pressure of getting good grades, really, because sometimes the pressure to get good grades actually prevents people from learning, strange as that sounds. But it's because they just sort of don't want to ask what they think is a stupid question, because somehow they feel it's going to bias the professor against them. And, by taking that away in the boot camp, by having it pure pass fail, and everybody's going to pass, it does promote learning. It just takes away some of the stress.
Right. And even from an industry perspective, when I interview or look at job candidates coming in, the last thing I want to see on the resume is the GPA.
Right.
I mean, it's an accomplishment to finish the master's or finish the PhD. I'm not concerned with, you've got a 398 and this student's got a 395. It's like, you're covering the same material. It's supposed to be at a graduate level. It's more focused on learning, not, crossing the T's and dotting the I's. So I typically throw that out and recommend, I mean, even to other people in the industry hiring, like, GPA is nothing. It should be more focused on what courses did they take, how well do they do in the interviews, those sorts of things.
Right. And like a way to think about it and say, the difference between 398 and 395 is statistically insignificant, right? And so what we're getting to is, this, later when we talk about rankings, it'll be the same story, that you're trying to measure something and you're measuring with error. So, GPA is a measurement, and it's an error prone measurement. I mean, it's like, there's people who get lucky, there's people who get unlucky, for one thing. And there's also just people who somehow are good in tests and not good in tests. And, the real world is not a typical test situation, right? So, yeah. So,
yeah, it's more on we're hiring recently, and one of the hiring managers mentioned, they said in the interview to the candidate, I care more about that you can find the answer than you just knowing the answer.
Yeah.
I think that's critical, because we're mentioning the self-learning aspect. Like, if I have a really complex problem in the industry, you're not going to be able to pull out, something simple and just look it up, but you're also probably going to have to go back and look at all the first principles and kind of build towards that solution versus just knowing the solution magically.
Right. Even knowing, when to think about it yourself versus when to ask is not a trivial decision. It's not an easy decision,
Yeah.
So, and it shouldn't be a reflex. Like, it shouldn't be one or the other always, it's a difficult balancing act, basically, and trying to sort of get to the best answer in a reasonable amount of time. And there's kind of no easy answers, so you can get lost. I've gone down rabbit holes trying to figure out something on my own, and I could have just asked someone. If I knew the right person, let's say, might have saved a lot of time. So
yeah, definitely. And so this is probably the most controversial question of the entire interview, but I think one of my struggles with the rankings, the program structures, all the new information coming in on how are we incorporating everything, is I think most programs are starting to lose the sight of what quantitative finance is, and how do we narrow that down into an actual definition. And of course, I'm always up on my soapbox telling people, if you're not building models of some sorts, you're not a quant. And that offends, of course, masses of people that are doing execution trading and other computer sciencey kind of topics. But I think for programs, for curriculum design, it's crucial for the programs to have some sort of statement of purpose, some sort of goal that they're working towards. Because as you're mentioning, right, we're talking about you need to learn all these different skills, you need to have it narrowed down. And yet, finding a lot of programs are teaching kind of formulaic quant finance. Like this is the equation for the Black-Scholes. This is the equation for, expected credit loss. This is the equation for this. And it's great when you pull these textbooks out. I've got textbooks and it's got, this is the Black-Derman toy model, and they list out these equations. But in the real world, it's not really helpful when you have an equation. It's just a starting point of this is the general structure, but we have problems that aren't going to fit in these molds. And so I think a lot of the programs are starting to kind of get to that point where it's like, we're trying to cover everything. So you took a semester of data science and you barely touched the surface. And then you took, stochastic calculus, which is my most frustrating topic because I feel like programs like cram this into like this one, you have one class and then you're just done. And the further I've gotten into my career, I'm not even in derivative pricing or anything, but I'm working on time series for stress testing. I'm having a hard time teaching everybody because like we have to go back to measure theory and we need to go back to the sampling and the probability of how we're building out these time series from a theoretical, standpoint. But no one has that background. I feel like a lot of these programs in general are just trying to cover too many topics too fast. And we're just throwing out the window what quants are because I've seen programs, I've been on another podcast and they told me, this guy's a real quant. Dimitri, you're really nice, but this guy's a real quant. I go, what do you mean he's a real quant? They go, he works in investing. Okay. And we're starting to talk to the guy and you start talking about, we're building these factor models. And I go, okay. So I started asking more questions about what is a factor model for the guy. They're not even checking stationarity of the variables, which helps define what a factor is. It's non-time varying. And yet they're just throwing in like GDP, unemployment, and like, they're talking about, we got profits coming out of it and it's exciting and it's fun. And I'm like, you've got a business degree, like we're talking about, economics, you probably know those utility functions, the accounting, but you're not able to really structure theoretically the math theory and the statistical theory into that financial framework and make actual tangible solutions with it. And I think it's so hard to teach that. I mean, it's not like you can just run in and say, here, Peter gave me this great book. I read it and now I'm like an expert overnight.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so we're, let's say, agreeing you have 1 to 2 years to somehow prepare people. And, it's sort of strange, but teaching abstract thinking is actually useful for like what happens later in life, because it's sort of in the nature of abstraction that one is taking the essence of a problem and reasoning about it without necessarily, dealing with all the details. So there's this joke that mathematicians, are people who are such that everything they say is true, but they never know what they're talking about. And, that's how math can be defined. And so you ask what quantitative finance can be defined. Well, we define the quantitative side of that is that everything you're saying is true, but you don't know what you're talking about. And so, so let's say maybe the finance side of that is so that we are actually know something about what we're talking about. And, so, as a concrete example, I was taught at UCLA when I did my PhD there, so-called Ross arbitrage pricing theory, the factor model that he developed in the 70s. And it's an abstract thing. There's n factors, none of them named, and they have certain statistical properties, like they're uncorrelated with each other, and there's an error term uncorrelated with that. And but let's say it's math, okay? But let's say it's it's up to you to apply it, let's say. But it's actually been very useful in my career to sort of organize my thinking as a framework. And so that's kind of, let's say, something that, can be taught in an academic setting that's actually, I think, useful later in life, even though, let's say, it's not, as presented, completely applied. It's really just a way of thinking. And, later you'll be, attaching financial realities to these abstract variables. But, so that's sort of a way to, just to summarize it, a way to sort of maximally communicate relevant modes of thinking is via actually abstract approaches, since they're sort of by definition going to cover two or more distinct applications.
Right.
So, right. Which is very much in line with what you were saying, I think. So, get the basics across, like linear regression, without knowing what necessarily the dependent variable is as a name and what the independent variable is as a name, so it's okay. I mean, if you know how there's a theory for that, and it's important to know, I'd say, just because that's one of the most, that and Taylor series are probably the most widely used things in practice,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah. And I always felt really odd. I graduated and I never connected the dots. For example, like stochastic calculus was time series.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, they're two separate things, right? You've got stochastic calculus, which is a math thing, and it's just math. And then you've got, time series, which is just statistics, regressions
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about. And yet, kind of as we're talking, it's important to be able to connect those ideas throughout a career to kind of get to
Yeah.
that. I've started trying to make, educational material, and of course I've released nothing because I'm running into that trap, which is how do you layer. I keep going backwards in time, like, oh, I can teach this, and it's really straightforward, and it makes a lot of sense. And then I presented it at some sort of a university for a presentation, and then the students go, it was amazing, it's great, but I didn't understand what you were talking about. And then I'm like,
Mm.
okay, well, so have you taken, these sorts of courses? And they go, well, no, I haven't taken these yet. So I'm like, okay, so I'm starting to try to backtrack, but it's just there's so many, I guess, prerequisite layers
Mm-hmm.
into those sorts of topics. And I think that's some of the challenge I face, and some of the challenge I think a lot of these programs face, which is, I guess we can go into rankings here a little bit. I don't like the way that a lot of the programs are structured, in the sense that they try to take a shotgun approach of anybody under the sun can join a quant program. And then you try to train everybody from this varied background.
Well, yeah, heterogeneity is definitely a challenge. And besides the boot camp as an effort to homogenize, I mean, the other things we do is for our so-called core classes, we actually have flexibility so that, people select from a menu instead of, these are the classes, period. And so that's, plus, let's say, the heterogeneity means you'll have people who already know some of the material that normally is just taught in the master's level. So we certainly allow people to waive out through taking an exam. And so there's, and I guess, like, also just facilitating communication among students is super useful, because let's say, they'll they'll say, oh, that professor is really hard, or that professor less so. And then people will sort of self-select. Actually, some people actually want hard professors because they know they're going to be taught more,
Yeah.
and so they'll kind of self-select, which is going to promote homogeneity in each classroom. So that's a good thing. And yeah, I mean, it's probably the biggest challenge in education as a whole, though, is, which I never really, there's sort of partial steps you can take to mitigate the impact of heterogeneous students, but
Mm-hmm.
it feels like you're never going to solve this problem completely. Everybody's different. So yeah.
So let's dive in a little bit to the rankings here, since we're talking about this. I think so. Let's go into rankings as a whole. You had an excellent idea that you emailed me. We were talking about, rankings and how we go about rankings. And it was kind of the idea of like scorecards. So credit scorecards. That's what we do.
Mhm.
For those that don't know, on the banking side, you score out your credit worthiness. Typically, you have components like probability of default, what we're modeling. And then you'll layer in different factors like, I don't know, loan to value or your utilization rates, those sorts of things. And I think the current system, so that different rankings that are out there are somewhat structured like this, in a way that they have different areas that you get a score on, and then they have a different percentage of weight. So think about this like a beta coefficient, and then they add these up to get some sort of scoring across the board.
Mhm.
And I think it's a decent approach. When I start to come back to my quant side, I need the statistical relationship of how these weights are selected and applied. If not, they become very arbitrary. And I think it's hard for students to actually see, like, you have two programs, let's say number 7 and number 8. I mean, what's the difference between these programs? Are they the exact same program? Or is there really something different between the rankings on this? And so I agree. I think there needs to be more of a scorecard approach to it. But I
Mhm.
think the current so-called models, we'll call them, are so arbitrary that a lot of the factors that are being put into these just aren't meaningful.
Yes. So yeah, the analogy to a credit rating is the following: that when you're a bondholder, you lend money and you're looking for it to come back, and so so when you get a degree, you pay tuition. That's like the lending of money, and what's supposed to come back is actually skills that lead to a paying job. And so let's say the trouble is sometimes you pay the money and you don't quite get back paid in skills the full amount you thought you were going to be paid. So that's default risk. And so how do you ex ante assess the likelihood of being defaulted on by the academic institution is essentially the question. And and so let's say the trouble, well, let's say rankings can mean different things. Actually, it could just be that it's the output, so the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 and the names beside them, or it can actually be included within that, the methodology and the breakdown, and how individual schools scored on each component rather than just on the aggregate measure. And when that further information is provided, that can be incredibly useful because it deals with the arbitrariness of the weights that you suggested. And so somebody can, let's say, decide that the reason I'm getting a master's degree is, let's say, because I want to do a PhD, and therefore put much more weight on the academic side of things than on the placement function. Okay, so by having that data available is it's extremely useful. And the other thing you were, I think, alluding to is that, um, just like I mentioned earlier, the grades have measurement error. So it is the case that rankings have measurement error. So if you're asking, how do you distinguish between number 7 and number 8 in a ranking? My answer is you probably shouldn't. Okay, so you could distinguish between, let's say, number 7 and number 77, okay, but not number 7 and number 8. So the gist of it is, like in physics, there's this concept of significant digits that they sort of understand that they can't measure things out to arbitrary precision, and so they'll just tell you the numbers to the precision they think they can measure it. Okay.
Okay.
So and let's say when it comes to rankings, like for some reason we feel that the fact that we're going to use the numerical system that's based on the fact that we have 10 fingers, and use that to to kind of indicate how precise we can measure things. But the reality is that the measurement is crude, and so you could think about, let's say, treating 1 and 2 is the same, 3 and 4 is the same, 5 and 6 is the same. Okay, but 1 and 2 different from 3 and 4. Maybe that's the degree of precision you have, or maybe it's not even that fine. Maybe there's top 10 and there's top 20, and then there's between 10 and 20, and everything in 1 through 10 is this is or 1 1 through 9 is the same, 10 through 19 is the same. So those are, that point of view is taken into account, the ability to distinguish the different universities, just on the aggregate measure to begin with. Okay, and then there's, as I was saying before, you probably want to dive in and look at what's important to you, and try to, let's say, do the same exercise with the components. So and let's say, like another sort of a slightly different point, a ranking or a credit scorecard, those are both meant to sort of be the same for all users. But the reality is, it's more like, let's say, if you had to do the finance analogy, it's more like thinking about, a covariance of a university with your skill set that you come in with. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you're weak in math and you need to learn math, you want to go to a place that can teach you math rather than a place that's also weak in math. and strong in something else. Okay, so in other words, one needs to, like the rankings are presented as they're the same for everybody, but the reality is, you need to dig in and sort of figure out how the different components and the scores on each, co-vary, so to speak, with who you are, right? So like whether they make sense for you as an individual. So that's, they're not going to, other than providing the necessary information for you to do that, they're not going to, one has to sort of do that on your own, because only you know your own strengths and weaknesses. It's tempting to just sort of take rankings at face value as presented, but let's say one is, not taking full advantage of all the information in those rankings, if that's provided, by just looking at the output.
Right. And I think this is where I'm trying to come in as a different approach on the rankings of these. So going back to your precision, which is how do we get more precise? We get more data. If we have more variables, more data, and realistically, what I want, which I know a lot of programs don't want, but I want so much transparency that a student can walk in and say, this program is terrible. It does not fit who I am, right? I mean, maybe I'm coming from a math background. Maybe they're just teaching math and it's at an undergraduate level. It's not really preparing me for quants. And then I can come in and say, oh, this other program is teaching more on like statistics and maybe teaching more of the computer science and the programming side, as well as the finance, which perhaps I'm missing. And they can well round that. And so I think transparency is going to be key for this to really get better data. Because I think now the problem with the rankings, which I give them a lot of respect, they've done quite a bit of collecting this. But I think even like programs have done a horrible job in this fact of like they don't tell students like we're targeting this sort of student. And I think part of this is programs are afraid that, okay, well, I want to get as many applicants as possible. I want to sort through all these applications and then I want to pick and choose who I want. But my argument against that is that if you had more transparency on this is what my program specializes in, this is our main focus, we're not going to cover everything under the sun. We're not designed to do, data science. We're not designed to do different areas. That you could streamline these in a sense that would be so transparent for students that they could score these more granularly.
Personally, we put a lot of effort into our website to sort of allow people to understand what our program is about. So for example, we have every syllabus on our website for everyone to see. And
which not every program has.
Right. And I know why they don't, because it's actually a major effort to keep this, we have them up to date. So it's a major effort to keep, to have all the syllabi and up to date on the website every semester. And, especially when you rely on external people as much as we do. So it's a lot of effort, but I do feel it's worth it. And it does allow people to understand really, what we're about. So, and I was impressed that, you were doing sort of a deep dive into the different programs that you thought, let's say were worth ranking to begin with. And because yes, it's going to take a lot of time to look at, what is actually covered. And let's say, because it's certainly tempting as someone putting together rankings to just look at, let's say, the output as opposed to the input, so, the placement rate as opposed to, how skilled the people are when they're interviewing. And so the, placement rate, while it's certainly a useful stat, it can be, quote, massaged. Okay. It could just be that, the director of a program is, in touch with a lot of people and can get you that first job. And then you're fired 6 months after you get it and you can't work in the industry again because you don't know a thing. Okay. So what you really want to know, just think of it as like an NPV calculation. You want the present value of future cash flows from the time you graduate to when you retire. You want to maximize that. And, let's say placement rate is maybe positively correlated, but it's not the final answer. So it's a huge set of, potential variables. So, and some rankings, for some reason, choose to ignore variables that, one would think are important. Okay. So, in our case, we have very small class sizes, it turns out. Like the average is 15 students per class. And, we'll happily provide that information to anybody who asks it, but you know what? Nobody asks it. Okay, but we do it anyway. And it's extremely expensive to have, small class sizes. It means you have way more professors and, and all that, and we think it's important, but let's say we're not being rewarded for it. That's my complaint.
But,
you
but you're
know,
but you're
yeah.
being dinged though on the other side because you guys have a large cohort size, correct?
Yes, we do have a large cohort size, and I don't know if we're dinged for it, like we shouldn't be, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not specifically directly used about cohort size. I mean, if it was measured directly as penalized, the larger the worse the score, then I could take our cohort size is about 150 on average, and I could do the following. I could take my one program 150 and split it into 150 programs of one student each. I had really low cohort size per program, and I would be the top 100 programs probably when that was used as a criterion. And I didn't do anything, right? So it kind of gives you an idea that it shouldn't really be used directly. And to their credit, it's not actually, it's just reported, it's not used.
Right.
And so, I mean, actually, the first year that Risk did theirs, I think they used cohort size negatively, but then they learned their lessons, so they stopped. The way it comes in indirectly, though, is probably through placement rate, because that's usually measured, let's say, like the way QuantNet does it, for example, is at graduation and 3 months after graduation.
Mhm.
And so, you have a small cohort size, and let's say 3 months after graduation, they've got everybody placed. And then you have a larger cohort size, and 3 months after graduation, it wouldn't be the case that everybody's placed. But that doesn't mean that therefore you should go to the smaller program, because actually, like we probably have placed 3 times as many as the smaller cohort within 3 months of graduation. It's just more students to place, right? So
Yeah.
I think every statistic, I personally would want to filter through an NPV calculation. That's the way I think. And, there's work to do that rather than just multiply by whatever weight.
Right.
And there's so many variables, as I was saying before, many of which are not measured and directly. Admittedly, placement rate is an indirect measure of a lot of these things. So, but you can be, for some reason, for example, let's say these rankings, at most they look 3 months after graduation, but, if you're, the payback is a lot longer than just within 3 months after graduation, right? So,
Yeah,
so,
definitely.
so let's say one could look at, average salary 10 years after graduation, let's say, if you want to get a sense of how good these programs are, but they're not doing that.
Yeah.
Admittedly, 10 years is a long time, but 3 months is also very short. So maybe there's something in between.
But I think too, on part of this is kind of what you're getting at too, which is how do we narrow down into more specifics? And I think it's kind of a game of, so working on auto credit for some time, one of the things we struggle with when developing these sorts of models is how do you prevent people from cheating? And I'm not saying necessarily like you're lying, which we've caught and seen in the industry from these rankings, but also from the standpoint of, like, for example, they say, okay, job placement, as we're talking about, you might have 100% job placement. Well, I'm starting to find out that some programs have, let's say, 100 students, but they're only required to report 75 to 80% of the data. So you could have 25% unemployed and you got a 100% placement rate. And this rubs me the wrong way, because then the students are emailing me saying, Dimitri, can you help me get a job? And I'm looking at the rankings like, you've got a 100% placement rate, but you don't really have a 100% placement rate. And then the other piece I'm starting to figure out is I'm getting all these, hiring students that are coming in. A lot of them aren't qualified to do the work. And I think part of this is that the job placement looks great, but you're taking, we'll put them in air quotes, quants from MBA programs basically that have been restamped as quant finance. And then they're being churned out into like wealth management, but they're really doing like customer relations, or they're doing something like execution trader, or they're doing something like marketing analytics for PwC. And I think the programs are incentivized in a way to how do we maximize those numbers? And I think the rankings are somewhat default for this, because it's like, how do you get maximum job placement rate, right? That's what we want to focus on to get our rankings up.
Yeah, but let's say there's zero auditing
Yeah.
by the ranking agencies. of that important statistic. So, let's say the main critique is huge weight on placement and then complete trust that the universities are going to provide accurately this data. Well, so maybe a better approach is less weight on something that you're not testing on or verifying, and more weight on things that you can verify. Okay, so
Right.
so or verify the placement stats. So if a program reports 100% placement rate, then it's actually pretty easy to go on LinkedIn and search for the university and see whether or not the person is from the university is listing, looking for a job, or versus saying they're employed on LinkedIn. Auditing the results while it is work is one way to cut down on cheating. And then the other way is, only have verifiable criteria. So, like risk to their credit, they have citations. Okay, I know I watched one of your videos a few years ago, and you're saying, who cares about that? Well, actually, the good news is you can't fake it. Okay,
It's true.
So at least it's verifiable. They only give 5% weight on it, so it's not like it's a huge component, but at least it's verifiable. It's objective. It's done by Google Scholar. It's not provided by the university itself. So it's verifiable. And so anyway, just having verifiable criteria is, in my opinion, important to prevent cheating or cut down on it anyway. Universities are smart enough to not ask students to grade their own exams, but it does seem that most of the ratings agencies do ask universities to grade themselves on the most important criteria. So there needs to be some policing.
Right.
And even if it's just send me an email if you know somebody cheating. So it's one way to do it.
Yeah. And one way I'm trying to get around this is, I guess, somewhat counterintuitive, but it's how we deal with it in the industry. Is we don't necessarily expose the model to the end user. So, for example, for me, I'm scoring these programs, and I'll send them all the questions, but I want to make it such in a way that programs don't fully know how it's going to impact them.
Oh, to prevent gaming. Okay.
Prevent gaming, because so one of these things I try to review, as we talked about towards the beginning of the podcast here, which is, how do you get academic rigor? How do you set up this curriculum? And so someone who's gone through these programs, who's talked to a lot of students who've graduated from these programs, who does hiring now, so I can see what sort of classes are coming in. I'm trying to dig deep into these and say, what textbooks did you use? And how many chapters did you cover? Because I'm finding now too, you can plot, world famous quant books like Stephen Shreve's Stochastic Calculus books. And I'm finding some programs are trying to cover 2 books in a semester.
Okay.
And so, we're like, it's speed.
Heavy.
You're speeding
for
through
those
it.
2 books. Yeah. By the way, if you turn over the back of them, you'll see I have a blurb on Steve Shreve's Stochastic Calculus, and I called it the Bible of quantitative finance. So I guess you know what I think about it.
And so I'm trying to extract those and trying to take them from an industry perspective, in a sense too, that programs can't cheat. Because I started seeing back in 2011, when I was looking at programs, you would have starkly different descriptions on classes. You'd have like Stochastic Calculus, and it would go into depth, and it would tell you, we're using Stephen Shreve's, or we're using John C. Hull's book, and they're explaining all the details. And then you'd have another program, which I'd view a fake quant program, and it would say like, put call parity, and we're using like corporate finance fundamentals number 8. You can see clearly, one's the really high level business class, and that's fine. You get an application perspective. The other one's teaching you really nitty gritty details of math and how to apply these to derivative products. But now they've gotten smart. So a lot of those programs I used to watch, magically, their descriptions now are matching everybody else's descriptions. And so the problem for a student is, like, when you come and you read the description, you used to be able to say, this program's really good, this one's not so good, based on what I'm wanting out of a program, given my background. And so now I'm trying to dig deeper into these layers and say, okay, let's see what textbooks they're using. And of course, I've got stacks of textbooks. I'm just purchasing textbooks left and right, trying to keep up with what programs are using. Of course, looking at reviews online, reading through parts of these textbooks, and then trying to take that holistic perspective of, if your program's telling me you're bringing in math students, you better be teaching math at a mastery or PhD level, and you better be covering the right topics on this. And so it's trying to do those things where it's like, you can't, there's, infinite number of textbooks. Any program could choose a different textbook. but trying to use that as a gauge where it's hard to game the system because you're not able to say, okay, Dimitri approves of Stephen Shreve's book. We're all going to use Stephen Shreve's, but also trying to look at how many chapters are you actually going to be using. And then I recommended to another program that was asking about this. I said, list the professor. I mean, as a student, I tell students all the time, go on and look who the professor is. I mean, what's their background? Are they working in the industry? That might be a big positive for you. Maybe as we're talking about, citations and everything, maybe they've published a ton of papers in the quant finance realm. They're going to be an excellent teacher because they understand the ins and outs of these. Or is it more of a junior professor or a professor that teaches, traditional finance, but doesn't have that expertise and knowledge to teach it? So trying to kind of get to these points where it's hard to game the system, because we all know, right? I mean, high job placement equals good score. A high number of citations equals good score. A really low number of students to faculty ratio is really good. Trying to do what you're doing, which on two halves, one, creating it so it's a little murky for the programs, but then another half, if we can validate and verify these, trying to verify them as much as possible. And LinkedIn's been one of my key background tools of figuring out where are they placing students. I tell students this all the time. Say I'm going to go to NYU, Tandon, and they say, Dimitri, is it a good program? I go, well, I have to know what is your background and what are your goals. I said, figure that out first, and then go online and search where their graduates are being placed. You're going on and you're like, man, these graduates are in my dream job. This is like exactly what I want to do. That program is going to be the best fit for you, because obviously that program is doing something right to get students into those sort of positions.
That's right. So important to dig deeper. And let's say, it's kind of in the best interest of the better programs to quote, advertise that they're doing well. So let's say, be suspicious about those who are secretive about how things go, and then for the ones who are public, try to verify, because let's say it's, I really only hired 2 staff people since I joined 5 years ago, and one was a placement person, and the other was to oversee our website and keep it up to date, and more broadly communications, not just through the web, but through Instagram and Twitter and the rest. So anyway, I feel like communicating is extremely important, and it's gotten even more so with the pandemic. So basically, used to be that people could come on campus and see what we're doing. It was a little difficult when we were locked down. So anyway, but even since I brought up the pandemic, I mean, it's short-term relevant how different universities are dealing with it, right? Because if they're fully remote, that's a different mode of instruction than if they're at least trying to be on campus. So I mean, it's that's just hopefully just a near-term consideration, but it is something very much on my mind. We're about to start in-person classes in a week, despite the fact that Omicron's raging here, and so it shows a commitment to in-person instruction anyway that not all universities have.
Right, and I to be honest, I don't think there's any way to make online learning as good as on campus. I create educational things all the time, which is fine, but it's not the same as being in person. It's not the same. I mean, even as a student, you're sitting in class, it's nice to have the guy next to you who's brave enough to raise his hand and say, like, I don't understand why that piece of the equation canceled out. Can you explain where that went?
Yeah. So I'm in agreement with the caveat that I always record my classes now, even though I'm teaching them in person, like still, just because I do think actually having the ability to do video review afterwards is valuable. So, I think, the one silver lining, let's say, of the pandemic is everybody's very familiar now with video meetings, and it would be a shame. I think it's a shame if like we don't take advantage of that going forward. So once there's no need to from a pure health reason perspective.
Yeah, I really wish I had that. I mean, I remember in my stochastic calculus classes, the teacher would start on the one side of the chalkboard, and then it was just like this mad dash of we've got 45 minutes for class or whatever, and it was just like a sprint, and no one can answer questions. And then as soon as that chalkboard is filled, they'd fill the other side, and then they'd slide it over.
Yeah,
The
right.
problem is you can't see the notes anymore. And so then you're like looking around the classroom, like, what did he put down? But then, of course, you're missing all the
Yeah.
new stuff now on the board.
The nightmare instructor is writing with one hand and erasing with the other, and yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's true. Yeah. Anyway, but on the whole, I mean, I feel like most of the programs I interact with are decent and trying to improve. And so so it's a legitimate let's say it's a legitimate enterprise, I'm pleased to say. And you know it's no surprise that students are paying tens of thousands of dollars for the education, because definitely worth it at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So I you know really got a lot of mileage out of the advanced degrees I got. And it's kind of, to me, kind of cool that something seems so abstract and esoteric could actually be useful. But so it's a testament to the sophistication of the financial industry. And it's only getting more so.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like, I actually think quant finance was a fringe thing when I graduated in 1988. And so it's really become much more mainstream, viewed through a long lens. And I think it can only continue as well, thanks to Moore's law and ever more data, thanks to all the cell phones we're carrying around and the implications of that.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking to someone recently about really how young quant finance is.
Mm-hmm.
We all kind of think like statistics is really old and quant finance is really old. But then you start thinking about what Fisher Black's paper that the Black-Scholes came out in 1973,
Yes.
somewhere around there.
Yeah.
And even for
Less than
like,
50 years old,
yeah.
so
And then
yeah.
thinking about everything we do today, I mean, I can't model credit scorecards on credit risk without a computer. And yet,
Mhm.
common computing, I mean, you're looking at early 90s, late 80s. And of course, the computing power, yes, of course, is slower than my phone. And of course, now we're doing massive sets of data. And even like modeling for the credit side, I mean, CECL and Basel and like Dodd Frank Act and all that. I mean, those are what in the last 2016, I think was CECL, 2010 was Dodd Frank. And as we're having all these new regulations come in, there's basically more quant work being created out of the requirements to model things. And so I think we're just, like you're mentioning, we're just opening up to, it's just going to get bigger and bigger as there's more and more requirements to model more and more aspects of finance as it gets more complicated.
Yeah, that's true. So that's why, getting back to curriculum design, I say, it's just super important to, teach the fundamentals as opposed to, let's say the trendy topics of the day, mostly. So
How would you go about trying to combat that? Because this is part of my concern. I feel like I'm ethically obligated for the students. I could care less what the programs think. But then I'm trying to weed out, right? How do you emphasize or measure like academic rigor in a course?
mhm. um, well, um, I mean, you may not be able to get the stat, but let's say the one measures the average grade. Okay, I mean, if we got an A, it's probably not that difficult. And so but looking more at the material, I mean, the syllabus is already a good place to start, but then if you can also get your hands on the assignments and ideally the exams, and actually those are more public than they used to be. So
That is true.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you can see what students are being asked to answer either on an assignment or a test. And I would also say, social media, when it gets, when it, like this, so every, at least in our program, WeChat is widely used. And on any particular course, I mean, there'll be, it's actually easy to search of what, students who took the course think about it, and so So, I mean, it's, that's really the ultimate assessment of academic rigor is what students who took the class thought of it, right? And not just, as a summary statistic in a teacher rating, but, but actually when they're responding to questions about the course, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I've started interviewing alumni, trying to get that perspective a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
One of my complaints from programs is that when I went to school, everyone took the business classes. Everyone took the finance classes. They were so much easier than taking, math or stats or whatever. And so the rankings on those were extremely well. But I think once you graduate and you've been in industry for a year or two, then you start getting a really good feedback on, that one class that I thought was complete garbage and I hated it and it was way too hard, or the classes are typically being used. And so I think trying to get that alumni connection as well to see where students are being placed, and then also seeing how they review the program, 2 years, like you're talking about, right? You can't view a program 3 months away. The net present value needs to look out, 5 years, 10 years, hopefully continuing on forward.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So I think we have an alumni association. We've had social events when it was allowed, and we definitely. Well, latest thing we did is we're actually using our alums to do technical interviews of our current students.
Oh, perfect.
So, and we were surprised how easy it was to get volunteers. We actually wanted to pay them, but it just a lot of, because of a lot of our graduates international and their visas just don't allow us to pay them, but there was no problem. I mean, they were all volunteering to do technical interviews of our current students. And, that's one way we're definitely involving them. If you're contacting programs, I mean, you can definitely ask them for names of alums who they have found to be responsive. And that's certainly a way to see what the program's about. Because you'd know where they're placed and you'd know, as you're saying, what they're actually using on the job, as you said.
Yeah, that's great advice. I'll definitely add that in. I've been doing current students like right towards graduation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do a exit survey for students who are graduating as well. And so that's more like they fill out a form. We read those carefully. It's like, especially when they're sort of, it's like an exit interview for a job, right? Like, as you know, when someone quits or often there's an exit interview, and there's a good reason for that, right? They're free to speak freely, and often you learn a lot of useful things when somebody is just walking out the door, especially if they're quitting. So yeah. Which I suppose, we don't have that though. I mean, let's say, the reality is most students graduate. So we don't get that much. We really don't have too much dropouts, but getting back to your academic rigor thing, the more academically rigorous the program, the greater the dropout rate would be, you would imagine. Right?
Yeah, that's real. I think that's really my concern on how you rank these. Because I look at a lot of programs and it's like the curriculums are all getting to be close to the same.
Mm-hmm.
The job placements are very different. And yet I'm thinking if you brought, I mean, I'd be probably the worst example of this. So if you bring someone in like me who has no math background, you've got business math, Calc 1, Calc 2, having to catch up, make those leaps is not very feasible. And then when you have someone that graduates, they're going to be somewhat disgruntled because they came in thinking they're going to get, this on the return, like this type of job. And then when they end up being in a different type of job, you end up having that disgruntledness. But at the same time, I cringe. I apologize, but I just can't stand the business school mentality of it because I think business schools make it so easy. I mean, as an example here, so I was the only finance student along with a classmate of mine. We already took those finance classes. We took them at Ross, so top-rated MBA program, top finance professors. They were the exact same classes we had already taken in undergrad. And I came from a no-name finance school. I came from Washington State University in the middle of a wheat field. The other student came from like a no-name school in Florida. And we had A+. I never had 100% on a class. I had 100% in this class.
Okay.
It was just like going through the fundamentals. And I think that's kind of the challenge we're talking about too, right? Which is You want good rankings because you want to see that students are learning, but you also
Mhm.
want to make sure the classes aren't so easy that you've got, I guess you would address it in the way you're talking about, right? With the grade distribution. You don't want to see everybody with an A. You'd want to see
Yeah.
spread between A's down to B plus, whatever the B minus or.
Yeah. It's like, I mean, I'm glad you brought up MBA programs because let's say, as we all know, they, let's say, typically it's 4 years work experience before someone starts an MBA program. And, they take a wide variety of backgrounds. So you couple those things together, and it basically means you can't have, too much math in the curriculum, right? They'll be a revolt. So, so I used to teach in a business school. I'm pretty sure I know what I'm talking about here. And so let's say, so what it does suggest is, if you want a sense of the academic rigor of a given master's program, you actually look at who they're letting in. I think you brought this up, but if they're if they're not if they're only letting in people with certain prerequisite courses and certain minimum GRE scores on the quantitative side, then that does suggest the classes are going to be a little more rigorous than if they're letting, basically anybody in with, let's say, 4 years work experience and, a 600, what's it, GMAT. So,
Yeah, I mean, for me, I just see it so skewing the business programs because you can excel on QuantNet, you can excel on risk.net. Is your job placement good? Of course. These MBA programs are so tight knit together. They know all the alumni, they're placing students. Again, they could be placing them as marketing analysts, they could be placing them as management trainees, or they could be placing them as, I don't know, some sort of job. The pay for an MBA grad is really high.
mm-hmm.
Because it's all in network and you went to a top 5 school and they've got all these connections. So you're making a lot of money coming out. So you're going to pass that on the rankings. STEM designation these days means absolutely nothing. I mean, I could teach, I don't know, English and put like how to add numbers together, some arithmetic in there. You get a STEM designation stamp. So that knocks that out. And so part of my rankings too is I want to nudge these programs into like, this is quant finance. We all should be working towards that. And I completely understand, right? There's never going to be a perfect program. There's financial constraints. I mean, you can't just hire a million professors. There's student constraints on what sort of students you accept or don't accept and how many there are. And then, of course, you have free market competition between all the different programs, which is good. But I think a lot of the business schools have gotten into this position, which is very unpopular with most of the programs in these rankings, is that they perform extremely well. And they don't even have to lie on the numbers. They could be 100% honest. But the reality is they're not training the students for the job. And that's where my gripes, I guess, coming towards. And I've dinged a few programs that were ranked. One of them was ranked like number 1, number 2. And yet I made some comment about them and they commented in my YouTube video, we would have loved to have accepted you if you would have joined our program. And I remember thinking, like, you have to be a complete moron to accept me. Like I applied to Columbia. I wanted to go under, Manuel Derman and do all that. I applied to Princeton and Cornell. I might have applied to NYU. I applied to like 4 programs my first year and I got accepted to none of them. And looking back, they were all in the 100% in the right. No one should have accepted me to be in these programs. I just didn't have the background to do it. And luckily I switched degrees and took off an entire semester and just spent time studying math and stats and trying to get to that level.
Mm-hmm.
But there's that piece there that's like, we need to ensure, at least I'm trying to ensure, when I list that ranking and say this is a quant program, that you're really going to get placed somewhere in quant finance. You're not going to get, side railed into an MBA program, or you're going to get something you didn't really pay for.
Yeah. So what you're getting at is one needs to dig deeper than placement rate and see exactly where they're going, right, and what they're doing in their jobs. And and that can be part of the score. And it's harder, definitely. But we do put on our website the nature of the companies that people went to,
Mm-hmm.
which tells you something. But I think Carnegie Mellon in particular does a really good job of putting where exactly the roles that people got. So you can't attach names to it so that that it'd be verified. But at least, specifically listing the job title is definitely helpful. We also, thanks to our placement person, we've got a lot of statistics now about where our graduates are. And let's say, just to summarize it, I mean, we're in New York, so obviously they mostly go to New York, and they tend to go to large banks and hedge funds, but we're always looking for new avenues for placement. So I had breakfast recently with an insurance risk manager, and we're going to introduce a course there because that's a big industry, and it's not historically been as quantitative as the other places I mentioned, but they're moving that direction. It is tricky to look beyond the numbers that are publicly available and let's say typically unaudited, and get a deeper sense of how successful a place has been.
Okay. So to wrap up this whole podcast here, just a final thought and a final response and discussion on this is, I think programs would do. So what do you think of this, of having programs be more transparent on the marketing? So I've been trying to nudge programs in that direction of like, if you wanted to take in only business students and you wanted to turn them into quants, market that. Like, go out and tell students, we would love to have finance students, economics students, and we'll turn you into a quant and we'll focus that. But I think a lot of this is that there's just not enough marketing perspective on this. Your program's really good to look at. It's interesting because you guys have so many electives. And I like to see programs that have tracks as well, because you can start to see, okay, right, you've got all these core courses. It gives you the fundamentals. And then I think if the programs did a better job on marketing what sort of students they're going to be placing, it would, I think, change the whole landscape of the quant finance rankings, because you'd start to see, okay, I want to segregate these out, which is, this is the best like financial engineering program. So you're actually doing derivative product pricing. You're actually working in financial engineering. And then it'd be great to see, this program specializing in credit risk, or this program specializing in data science for, quant funds, could be hedge funds, banks, whatever. But I think if banks could go about that, or firms or programs could go about that path, it would just create such clarity for the students in the programs. It would also differentiate everybody in the sense that you don't need to be number one on the ranking, but you could be the best program that focuses in like risk management on the credit side, or you could be the best program in something else.
That's a really good point. So I'm going to take that into account in our own marketing. I mean, we're the opposite of wanting undergraduates in business. We actually want people with the math and quant skills already in a way, and don't know the finance, and we'll teach that. So that's really, what we're doing in many other programs. And, it's actually good getting that message out, because let's say it would be reasonable to, if you don't know anything, it would be reasonable to think that a master's in finance should require an undergrad in finance, which is not the case. And I've told specifically the gentleman who handles our placement to focus more on pure science, actually, than he has in the past. And so I think that's the future. And but we do take the reality is we take people with computer science, engineering, math, physics, economics, and finance as and everybody's got something to learn. And it does cause a challenge that there's the different backgrounds, as we brought up earlier. But anyway, it's we need a broad base, because again, as you mentioned, we're a large cohort. That's, the large cohort and the large number of electives go hand in hand. So we can only offer, these electives that are on, let's say, cutting edge topics like blockchain technology, and we have a sustainable finance course starting in a week. And because we have a large cohort size that can take these, when you offer a class, it doesn't make economic sense to run it for us if it's 4 or less. And so with our scale, we can offer classes like I mentioned and have the minimum number of students. But if you're 1/3 our size and you offer those classes, you're going to have 3 students take it, and it doesn't make sense to run it, so.
Yeah.
So anyway, so we've chosen to have large cohort size and diversity of course offerings. Other and part and parcel with that will be that it takes longer than 3 months to place the entire group, and we'll be punished on the rankings, and we're just going to live with it. That's the decision we made. And it's we're fortunate that there's multiple rankings, not just one, and that it seems to be a competitive space, actually. That there's risk entered a few years ago, you're sort of entering now, and we're definitely in favor of that, like a healthy competition, not just among the programs, but among the rankers of such programs. So I think it'll cause everybody to be at the top of their game. And so we welcome your efforts in these directions. And I thought your the one you did most recently made a lot of sense. Like I noticed that you shied away from the traditional number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and I think that's because you understood that there's a lot of quote noise in what you're trying to measure, and so you bucketed, which makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Thanks for coming on.
Okay, my pleasure. It was nice talking to you, Dimitri.